Welcome to the Ask a Cycling Coach podcast presented by TrainerRoad. I'm Coach Jonathan Lee, and today we have Alex Wild with us from Cycle Sports Specialized, Carbs Fuel. Stoked to have you, Alex.
Hey, everyone.
You and I get to race, actually, together. Well, on the same course, I should say. We get to race on the same course in just a couple days here. If you're listening to this, the race has already happened. It's going to be the Lake Tahoe mountain bike race. Somewhat of like a old-time tradition that race happened here. What format are we doing, Alex? Let the people know.
Yeah, I think they offer technically XC 2-hour and then 4-hour. So we're signed up for the 4-hour. It's a fun loop through Burton Creek Park in Tahoe City. If you're ever in the area, it's a fun spot to cross-country ski in the winter or cross-country mountain bike during the summer. And yeah, I think it's just one of those fun races that just get a little bit of intensity and get a bit of community. And it's like 5 minutes from where Jen and I normally stay. And I twisted your arm into joining, so it'll be a good time.
Didn't have to twist too hard. I'm pretty excited for it. It's going to be a blast. I've raced 2 nights in a row now. We did a criterium on Tuesday. It was the first crit I had done in almost 2 years, which is pretty crazy. Took a long break from it for a while, and man, it was good to be back. Loved that. That was really fun. And then after that, last night we did short track on basically an XCO course, and it was brutal. A 40-minute short track. Oh yeah, at 8,000 feet too. So
Yikes.
That was really good. Lots of pain, but really good and exciting. It's fun to be racing again. And I want to spend some time in this episode talking to you about like the equipment and nutrition choices and everything else that you've made. And I think that could make for an interesting podcast for people. Yeah. So if you're into tech nerdy stuff, if you're into setup and the sort of decisions that we make that we feel like eliminate potential issues on the day, that's what we're going to go into. Are you racing Truckee Tahoe Gravel as well? That's coming up next week.
Yes. So I will do that the week after the Tahoe race, and then a weekend off racing, and then Tusher, and then Tahoe Trail 100. So
okay,
four races in 5 weekends.
Yeah, that's really good. What bike are you going to use at Truckee Tahoe Gravel? Now, it's known as being a gravel course that is not like the gravel that we see in the Lifetime Grand Prix. It's usually like really rough, but I think things have changed this year. What do you run?
You were telling me that. I rode the course last year but didn't race, and it was one of those courses that I was considering doing like a 47 gravel tire on a mountain bike type setup, just because some of the double track descents were pretty rough, and I feel like there wasn't enough like all out speed, I guess, for a gravel bike. But this year you said it's a bit more buffed out, a bit more smooth, and that the main section was that double track we were talking about with those big random boulders in it. So I think this year I'll probably run pretty close to what I'm planning to run at Tusher, which is going to be the Crux with 47 tracers with no inserts. So that's been what I've been running since Unbound, and I really like that setup.
And while we're saying these things, Rob, our producer, will be putting them on the screens, and you can see like the tires that we're talking about and everything else. So if you're just listening to this on Spot or on whatever platform you're using, you could also go over to YouTube and check it out and watch it there. And before I say anything more, we've officially and finally crossed over 100,000 subscribers to our YouTube channel. So thank you so much to everybody. That's amazing. It's pretty awesome that we've gotten to that benchmark. Really exciting times. And we put out a bunch of content across YouTube that all makes you faster. So check it out if you haven't. And one other thing, actually, before I go any further, we have to give a huge congratulations to one of our own here at TrainerRoad, Tiffany Keep. She's qualified for the Olympics. I'm just like so stoked for her. She's going to be representing South Africa. We've mentioned Tiffany before. We're talking top fives at stages at Cape Epic. Winning the Cape Town Cycle Tour, which, as I understand it, is like the largest mass participation cycling event. Very hotly contested too. And we're just super stoked and proud that one of our own here, Tiffany, an employee of TrainerRoad, is going to the Olympics. It's amazing. So mark your calendars when they're going to have the road race, and you can watch Tiffany and see her. Just it's going to be really cool. You can be cheering for TrainerRoad while watching the Olympics. It's exciting stuff.
Yeah, congrats, Tiffany. That's sick.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's get into, and then you're not doing Downeyville, but I am. That's going to be my goal race in just a couple weeks.
They made it the same weekend as Tusher this year. I'll be missing it, unfortunately.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mean, yeah. And because you're not there and everything else, I'm hoping that start might be a little less vicious, but I'm sure that it won't be. So I'm sure it's
Hey,
going to
that
be
was
really tough.
Keegan's fault, not mine.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. He won't be there either. He'll be at Tusher. So, yeah, hoping for that. Okay. Let's get into some equipment stuff. I want to talk about changes you've made this year. We recently, if you've listened to the podcast, you've listened to the podcast that we did actually, where we had some of RockShox's engineers on to talk about RockShox's Flight Attendant. Alex, you're on the Epic 8 just like I am, and you have Flight Attendant.
Yep.
I have changed, and I didn't talk about this a whole lot on the previous episode, but I have changed a huge amount in how I tune my bike and set up my bike as a result of like Flight Attendant. Have you found that too? Like, are you running different suspension pressure, rebound settings, or tire pressure, or anything else different because of it?
I found that I change it more course to course. One interesting thing at Whiskey I did was I ran really low pressure because there's no big hits, but I know that the only time it's going to be like full open is when we're going like shooting down descents. So it made it really small bump compliant because, I mean, you've ridden the course before. Pretty much as soon as you're done with Skull Valley, you haven't?
No,
Oh.
I still haven't done that race.
So it's like a lot of more flat undulating turns where you kind of just need traction in the turns. So kind of having like a more sunken in bike, lower center of gravity, kind of making that middle softer kind of gives you a little more give, but knowing that there's not going to be any big rock gardens where I'm going to bottom it out or anything. So I think I really took advantage of the fact that like you can override it for one, so I can hit the button and I can lock it out anytime I need to. And then the other thing I did for Whiskey is you can set it to never lock out, both front and rear, never lock out the fork, or set it so it can lock out. So I made it so that it never locks out the fork. And I found that just so like when you're rolling along and pedaling at a good click, it'll try to lock out sometimes, but you still want kind of like that hardtail feel, I guess, on that terrain. And then, so essentially for the road start, I had it just manually locked out, overridden. And as soon as we hit the trail, I just let it do its thing. So I found that I can kind of, over like a brain setup, I can change a lot the characteristics of it. Like if I did something like Downeyville, right? Like I'd probably run maybe even 10 to 15 PSI more than I was at Whiskey.
Yeah, because of the harder hits that you'll have.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's really interesting because I feel like, so for me, I used to run a lot less pressure in my tires.
Mm-hmm.
And then I used to run more pressure in my suspension.
Mm-hmm.
And then even like things like I liked softer grips, and all of those things were adding up to make like the bike a certain amount, like to achieve a certain amount of compliance.
Yep.
And now, like you said, since I know that the bike, I don't have to dial in the bike to be stiffer in the suspension so it sits in the right place and pedals in the right place. That's taken care of by the damping of the middle section, right? That middle setting. Because I don't have to do that, I'm running. So before I was running like 100 and for like pressure, and this is relative to the shock and the leverage design. So I'm sure it's different, but I'm going to share it just the same. And then I'll talk about it in terms of sag, but I was running like 170 PSI, I think, in my last shock. And then now, and granted, it did have like a bit of a custom tune, so it might not be perfect across the board.
Which bike was that on?
And that was on the Epic Evo, but not so that was the previous generation Epic Evo.
With a Sid Lux or a Fox?
Correct. Sid Lux.
Okay.
Yep. And then now I'm running 140 PSI. That's like an absolutely massive change.
Absolutely.
And if you look at like the suspension calculators, because it's really important that you have, if you just look at like what you should pump a Sid Lux up to, that isn't going to go across to every single bike. If a brand has really tuned the shock in a specific way, they have a pressure in mind. And
absolutely,
I'm weighing about 150 pounds, and at about 150 pounds, I'm running 140 PSI in the shock. That gives me like 30 to just over 30%, probably like 32-ish% sag or something. And it's way more sag than I've ran before. I also am running slightly less in the fork, whereas I used to run like 76 PSI. I'm running 70 PSI in my fork. And I'm not running any spacers in the shock or in the fork. Yep. And I've found that the bike rides very balanced front to rear. I haven't had any issue. I've had, like, when I look at the O-rings, I've bottomed out the suspension, but I haven't had a single harsh impact as a result of bottoming out the suspension.
It's interesting how that feels balanced to you. And I think this goes to how individual suspension setup can be. Because, so for, I guess, my whiskey example, I was running 155 in the rear, 55 in the front. And that felt balanced to me, right?
Huh.
So it's just like how we sit on the bike differently versus like you say those pressures, and I'd be like, oh, cool. Like he likes to run his bike like raked almost, right? Like, because I'm comparing it to what I have. So I think it's interesting how many different things can affect how it works for you. So like we can run different pressures, but both of those feel balanced to us. Like we're both after a very balanced, neither of us are trying to make it so that the shot kind of dives.
Correct. Yeah. It's interesting. Right. And I ride with my shoulders very far forward over the bike, and like with my mass over the front of the bike a lot. Like that's like very much. And I drive with the front sort of a feel.
Which makes sense because the way I ride is normally like heels down. Like you think like the most exaggerated version of it, I would think, is like when you see MVDP ride a mountain bike between like those descents and he's like kind of just like straight legged. Like that's very much how I ride, and then like kind of drop my hips when I need to get to a technical section. So I ride more rear heavy than I do front heavy.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing that I've changed is the tire pressure, whereas I used to run, and I was running inserts and then running lower pressure, like 15, 16 PSI, typically 15 front, 16 rear. And now I'm running up, like last night at the short track race, I ran a 17.5 and 18.5. Okay. And at Downeyville, I ran 18 and 19 in the suspension when I just pre-rode the other day, and in the tires, not the suspension. And that worked fantastic. And at this point,
super aero setup, 19 PSI in the shock, just
sitting real low. And I don't think that I haven't had any sort of rim impacts or anything else like that, but still, I'm not sure I need to be running the inserts, and I need to do some testing with not running inserts to see how it feels.
I've never felt good on inserts on mountain bikes. Maybe it's just coming from never having run them. Like I only really run them on gravel, like very little even. Like I just don't do inserts very often. I don't like the way I perceive it makes the tire feel. Like taking up some of that volume, I feel like it takes some of the suppleness away. And with the current generation of controller cells that I run from Roval, I pair them with Renegades 99% of the time. And like, even if I do hit rim, nothing happens. Like snake bites are very unlikely with how rim design has come along. And that's probably one of the other equipment changes I made this year is we released the Team Limited Roval controller cell wheels. And those are interesting because they have the same like stiffness targets, even though they're running carbon spokes. They're a touch lighter. But what I found, and I've especially noticed this at Sea Otter, is that they track through corners better. So in my mind, I think when they're like leaned over, you don't get as much flex that way with the carbon spokes, because coming into like sand sections, I pre-rode on standard controller cells because before I got these, and then I got these and rode them, and it just felt through the sand, they're very straight, very predictable. Whereas like, I feel like the other ones kind of wiggle a little bit when you're putting that much pressure through them on sand. And so that was an interesting change as well, as I feel like those carbon spoke wheels are much more predictable through the corners, like a very confident line. Whereas like straight line speed and straight line tech, identical.
That's an interesting feel change, because that was my complaint with the control SLs is I felt a bit of vagueness, like not like a direct precision in a lot, and particularly in situations with turns or like lateral stress on the wheel, where it's like those off camber, really tricky rock gardens and that sort of thing. Like I felt like I lacked predictability. And the carbon spokes, like you said, that would make sense that it would add that, which is super interesting.
Yeah. You'll have to try these when I'm up in Tahoe. I think you'd enjoy them.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll just, we'll swap them right over. So, and then are you running 4-piston brakes now? Because that's
across
all
the
of
board.
us XC people used to run 2, but now We have those level ultimate 4 pistons. Then of course XTR has had 4 piston XTRs for a really long time too. So
I think it was a weird thing, right? Because when they launched transmission, they launched a 2 piston and a 4 piston, but they're almost identical weights. So it's at this point, it's why would we ever run 2 piston? Like, I can't think of a situation where I'd want to brake slower. Like and without being facetious, right? Like, I just don't think of a situation where a 2 piston would be an advantage anywhere. Like, I'd rather brake later, brake faster, be able to run smaller rotors, whatever.
yeah, that brake later, brake faster thing is so key. And I feel like it's something that every single rider listening to this, you could increase your lap times without any energy cost just by, and it's really good to practice this because then you can really hammer it home and understand it. So then you can apply it on the course. But have a turn, and then wherever you start braking for that turn just naturally, go back and then like put a pine cone down or a rock or whatever else you have, something natural where you hit your brakes. And then the next time, just put them 1 bike length closer to the turn, and then try braking from there, and then keep going until you can't make the turn. Of course, make sure everything's safe there, but keep going until you can't make the turn. The point isn't to make it so that you panic and nearly blow every turn, but the point is that chances are, if you look at like the linear feet of a course, you're probably traveling at a slower speed over more of those feet when you brake too early. And we all brake too early at first. We can always push further in. So it's a really good exercise. And I've found the same thing with like these 4 piston brakes. You get a braking advantage. I want to say that it's something like an 18 gram difference across the bike.
Yeah.
Like it's very small. So it's absolutely worth it. You know, I think it's a good one across the board. You mentioned that you were running Renegades. Are you running the 2.35?
Yep.
You might be running something that we can't talk about sometimes too, but 2.35 Renegades is the size that you're running these days?
Yeah, that's like my go-to XC tire. When we last updated, so Specialized has the Renegade, which is the most aggressive, fastest rolling tire. Then they have the Fast Track, which is still an XC tire, but a bit more aggressive. And then we have the Ground Control, which I've dubbed the Renegade Trail. It acts very similar to the Renegade, but you can take it to like Downeyville or Demo or UC or any of like the more technical riding places. So Renegades are what I run 99% of the time. For me, the way they designed the Fast Track, I kind of just consider it a mud tire. So essentially that's like my wet weather XC tire. So I ran that at Worlds last year in Glasgow when it was just completely muddy and soupy. Yeah, so 235 Control T5. Very long-winded name, but that's how. So the 2.35 is the width. The Control is the casing. So we have S-Works, which is like the lightest casing. Control, which is good for almost everything. And then you have Grid, which is a reinforced casing, less puncture resistance. Something like Arkansas, you'd want that for.
A lot of people like will try to draw the comparison to Maxxis and say that Grid is like EXO, but I think Grid is tougher than EXO. It's like their EXO Plus, you know? So
I feel like from what I know of Maxxis, EXO is like their standard. So I'd probably say that's like a control tire. And then Silk Shield is lighter or heavier?
Silk Shield is heavier, and it's either Silk Shield on the gravel side, or it's not the same technology, it's a different technology, but in their mountain bike tires, they have EXO Plus, and that would be akin to Grid, what you have.
And then it's max speed, right? Would be like the S-Works if you're a Maxxis guy.
Yeah, or really that's getting into the compound, right? And you said T5. So which tire compound, does that mean softer and grippier or firmer and faster rolling?
Yeah, the easiest way to do this, I think, for most people is comparing it to F1. So T5 is the firmest, fastest rolling. T7 is slightly softer, still pretty fast rolling. And then T9 is like that wet weather grip, slowest rolling, going to wear the fastest, the softest tire.
Yeah. Going to grip really well, though.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So anything else that you've changed on your mountain bike this year? Across the board?
Not changed, but it reminded me when we were talking about brakes. One thing that I don't like is mismatched rotor sizes. So I went up to a 180 in the rear of my Evo. For me, it's just like braking, I guess, muscle memory. Like I don't want to come into a corner brake as I normally do on my World Cup, my tarmac, everything that has standard brakes. And then my front brake is now more powerful and it throws off like my braking. And again,
Yeah.
it's one of those things that like a 180 rotor versus a 160 is 15, 30 grams maybe. So it's like, I'm not too concerned about the weight, and I'd rather have that consistent feel across my bikes.
And since you're running SRAM brakes, are you running the HS2 rotors? By the way, the amount of acronyms in this episode is next level. Are you running HS2 rotors or their centerline rotors?
Centerline 2-piece rotors. Yeah.
Got it. Centerline is their standard rotor that you've seen for a long time. HS2 is a thicker rotor, and it's also got some different construction to it where it's able to manage heat better as well. I've gone over to HS2s. I think that as a result, I have somewhere around like an 80-gram penalty, something like that.
They're quite heavy
However,
compared to standard, but they're really nice.
the power and consistency that I get out of it makes my normal brakes feel like they aren't like codes, right? The SRAM codes are next level on power, but it makes them feel significantly like more powerful, stronger bite, and less fade when I'm using the HS2s. I've just stuck with them, even though with the weight penalty, I just love the feel from them.
I think something like Downeyville with a long descent, you'll really feel that. I think more standard, I guess, XC stuff like maybe what we're doing this weekend, right? Where there's no descent longer than maybe a minute or two. I don't think I would notice, but I think it's that like long heat buildup that those really shine. Speaking of brakes, and I guess back to gravel, then I just finally put on the new Red on my bikes. And for the longest time, I was like, oh yeah, SRAM athlete, just reading the bullet points. Like, yeah, the hoods are great, whatever. But dang, are the braking on the new Red hoods so much better. Insane. Like,
really?
I was like, oh, so it's real.
It's not just marketing hype. Yeah, somebody had them in our crit the other night, and I felt the hoods, and I really liked them. They felt really good. And then he mentioned the fact that he's like, yeah, man, I just use my index finger to brake now, and it's just like instant power, and it's super easy.
Yeah. So. I think for me, I just defaulted to always being in the drops on descents because I didn't feel like I could get enough leverage. But now, like, did a 5-hour ride yesterday, and it's still getting the drops for like those longer descents just for lower center of gravity. But there's a lot more times you can just one finger brake. And they've also designed, I had an issue where when I'd one finger brake before, sometimes you would hit your next finger with the lever. Yes. But they've designed kind of like a little pocket for your fingers there. So that's kind really well designed.
The GRX lever design. The GRX kind of like bulges out there, and that allows you to have that control and still brake really well.
And it's got so it's really nice on the front now. You can adjust the lever as you always could, but there's now a pad contact on the side, and it has 4 settings. So you can adjust between those. Do you want it to bite early or bite later? And you can adjust those separate of one another. So you can say, for me, it's if you're watching on YouTube, you can see this, but like the first nick in my finger here, that's where I want the edge of the blade to be. So I hold in the drops and I put it in to just right that first knuckle. And then from there, I adjust the pad contact in. So that was pretty cool that you could adjust those separately and really dial in how you want them to feel.
That's a smart approach to how to do it. You know, it's kind of funny. I've always been, even on my mountain bike, I've liked my levers to be very far out so that, just like you said, the final, like the crease from the final knuckle on my index finger. And by the way, when you set up your brakes, you should set them up so that your finger is on mountain bikes, at least here. You should set it up so that your index finger is kind of almost nestling into the final little curve outward of your brake lever. So that means your brakes go inboard, like medially toward the stem on the handlebars, quite far compared to what you might think, because you only want to brake with one finger, and that's where you want it to be. That gives you the most power and leverage when you're farther out on the lever like that. I've always had mine so that it's lined up with that crease from the final knuckle. And then I love a really instant bite so that my brakes are like, they feel really responsive.
Yep.
And that's what I got used to from motocross. And I loved that. And I've never been able to get rid of it. And then I was talking to Richie Rude, which, by the way, congratulations to Richie Rude, TrainerRoad athlete. I shouldn't say TrainerRoad athlete. We don't sponsor or pay anybody, but he uses TrainerRoad to train all the time. And he's leading the enduro World Cup right now, which is amazing. The UCI Enduro World Cup. He won last year. He's just a beast. I was talking to him because Downeyville, a big concern for me is hand fatigue. That's a really long descent, and it can get to the point where you're kind of like, it's steep enough that your fingers are always on those brakes doing something. And at the same time, you're dealing with a lot of violence from the trail. So as a result, your hands can get really fatigued. And one of the things that he does is he runs his brakes so that when he pulls it, it's very close to the grip, which is nerve-wracking in some cases, right? Because especially if you experience brake fade, then your lever can make contact with your grip and you might not have a whole lot of power. But he runs it that way because when his finger isn't outstretched, when it's closer in toward the grip, the rest of his hand can relax a whole lot more. And it carries less tension, which then equals less hand fatigue. And so I've been trying to do this, and everything about it feels so entirely wrong, but I think I'm getting used to it now. But it feels really weird to go back to a road setup because on the road, if I set it up so that it comes in really close, then I do lose a lot of power.
Yeah.
But I'm running the SRAM level 4 piston brakes, and on those ones, on the mountain bike and on those ones, yeah, it's working. And I tested it out at Downeyville and the fade wasn't an issue whatsoever. So I think it's okay. But anyways, if anybody feels like they get tired hands, hopefully, maybe that's a bit of a help on setting it up.
Just got to get a fresh bleed, fresh pads right before Downeyville. And you have no issues.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, exactly. It's a good idea to do. The other thing I feel like, so I'm running a 100 millimeter -17 stem. And I really wish that Roval cockpit that they have, the one piece setup, had like a -17 option. That would be sweet because it's a really good looking handlebar. Is that what you're running, or are you running a barn stem?
I think you're running the Envy cockpit, so it's a little different. But I measured
Envy bars, but then I'm running the the S-Works SL stem.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I don't know how they compare to the Mini Rise, but I did measure the Mini Rise 100 -17 cut to my bar width of 740 is identical to the one piece 90, which I think we technically dub a -6. Like essentially I put them both on the edge of a workstation. And what I measured is where the hands would be, right?
Sure.
In relation. And they're exactly the same spot. So the 90, 740, one piece Roval cockpit actually puts you in the same place as 100 -17 with a 740 Mini Rise bar.
So that must be because of the geometry of the handlebars not lifting up quite as much, perhaps. Maybe they stay.
So we
lower.
Designed the cockpit around a flat bar. So it's a -6 if you used a flat bar. But since the Mini Rise is technically 10 mils of rise, I believe, it evens out. And also the sweep is slightly different, which is probably making up that 10 millimeters in stem length. So it's definitely hard. And I think this is across all brands, right? It's one of those sizing things. I would encourage you, if you can get to a shop and see it in person, do that same thing. So what I did is essentially you just plot it in space, right? You measure how far out, how far in, how far down, and try to match that as close as you can. So essentially that's what you want, right? You're starting at the top of the headset and you want your hand to be in the same spot. You don't really care how you get there. It can say -12, it can say -14, it can say -13.5. As long as you're in that comfortable spot, it really doesn't matter what the bar is. So that's always been a big thing for me because I love using the Roval cockpit, but I'm not going to do it at the expense of my fit. And I do know some athletes on the World Cup can't get, like, I think Sina is probably the most exaggerated example, just can't get what she needs out of that bar because she needs something like Nino's drop, right? Like a -20 some to really get over that head tube angle. That head tube height.
Yeah. And still have a short stem in terms of reach.
Yep.
Sina and both Nino, it seems like, also runs that with a really negative angle, but then not super long. So
yeah, I think Sina even runs. So she'll run a negative like 20 or 25 stem. I think she uses a Syntace one that's like half as tall, and then she'll run our Mini Rise bars upside down. So it's a -10 bar.
Whoa, that would be crazy. Yeah. But I mean, that's just shows the importance of making sure that you get the right fit. That's interesting. That's like also scary for my wallet, because then now I'm considering getting a pair, and then yeah, that's scary. But man, they look really good. So I'd be curious to ride
I
them.
just like how clean they are. Yeah. And then, I mean, besides the barfly mount we did with it, which I think is ugly as sin, but if you use a K-Edge headset one, then all is good.
So the cage one's like a top cap, basically.
Yeah, so it's like takes up 10 mils or 5 mils of space on top, and then you put the top cap on top of it, and it puts the computer in the exact same spot as the other one. But the
Yep.
barfly one is like a plastic one that like wraps up and around.
I've seen
And
that.
for me, it was like, we designed the bar. Oh crap, we have to put a computer on it.
Yeah, yeah, and it's kind of like it's designed to be sleek, and then there's this little like banana sticking off of there, to change it all
Yeah,
up,
for me,
so.
it's like I think I don't know, I could be wrong, and I'm taking nothing away from our engineers, but we put the hole for the bolt in the exact same spot as like the Alpinist and the Rapide cockpit. I feel like that's not
Different.
where you want it for a mountain bike.
Yeah,
So it'd be great if you needed an out front, but we should have put that bolt in the center of the stem and
Yeah.
then just had like a little dock, and you just screw that in right there. And then that would be the cleanest setup. But yeah, I prefer the K-Edge for mountain bikes. So I'll just run the ones that take up that 5 mil spacer on top and then run it forward. And then you can adjust up and down to what degree stem you have.
yeah, that's nice. When are you going to use the Epic World Cup? I rode the Epic World Cup and absolutely loved it. I raced it too, and I really enjoyed it. I think that it's an underappreciated bike, or perhaps better said, like a misunderstood bike by a lot of folks. But now that you have the Epic 8 with Flight Attendant, when are you going to use the World Cup? Because it is lighter. I think that you can probably, if you really, get driven on the build to make both very light, you can probably achieve like 1.5 pounds lighter, probably with the Epic World Cup. Maybe, I don't know. When would you run this?
I've stopped weighing bikes, so I couldn't tell you there. But the World Cup for me is a different type of efficient, if that makes sense. It's an overall stiffer platform in general, has less travel. So for me, like this weekend, I'll race the World Cup. And for Schwamigan and Leadville, 99% sure I'd race the World Cup. Like, I think for the more technical tracks, I think Tahoe Trail, I'm going back and forth, and it might be a good test, right? Like, maybe this is just my first year with Epic 8, and I don't realize like I could just race everything on the Epic 8 and it would be the same. But I still feel on the 8 that it still feels like a bigger bike. And it feel like the World Cup is just snappy, like immediately, right? Because it's not relying on a system to change. It's a dampening. And it's probably worthwhile I've shared this with a few people like on Instagram, or I think I've shared it on here before, but how I set up that rear shock, I've also gotten really happy with. So I run 100 mil brain on my World Cup. I don't think it needs 110. I feel like it feels more balanced.
Agreed.
So I run 100. Again, because I have the Epic 8, right? So it's like if I had the 110, then it's like we're really blurring the lines between these two bikes. Whereas like now 100, it's like this is kind of like where the hardtail was, right? Anything that's not super tech, anything you just want a little bit lighter weight, like anywhere it's where it's not a disadvantage, I'm going to choose the World Cup. And for the rear shock, what you do if you want to run it, so I run it, you set up the shock to you just look up the pressure that it recommends for your weight. You sit on it, you press the golden button, which will put it into no gulp, which means no sag. You get off, you'll put the pressure gauge back on, you'll drop the pressure 3 psi at a time. Between each time, get on the bike, make sure you don't have sag still. The first time you get sag, so say you went from 121 to 118, you got a little bit of sag, go back to 121, and that's your setting. And what that does is that you sit right on the cusp, and it makes it really small bump compliant, but it still makes it so that the rear shock can work as designed. So when you stand, it's still stiff. But for courses like Sea Otter, this is huge because I've found when you set it no gulp with the recommended pressure, at least for the way I ride, I just feel like it bucks me all over the place in the rear. And it's just not kind of sitting into those bumps, when you want to just sit down and pedal. So I think that helps a lot with how comfortable I feel on the World Cup as well.
That's an interesting point. It does feel different when you get out of the saddle and sprint. It feels hardtail like.
Yes.
You know what I mean? Like, and so there is like a different characteristic to it. The Flight Attendant makes the Epic 8 and all other, I feel like, full suspension bikes, as long as they have that middle position really designed with the intention of running Flight Attendant and really designed well. It makes full suspension bikes super efficient. But there is something different about it. Let's go over to gravel on that side. You mentioned that you're going to be using the Crux at Tahoe Truckee gravel. How do you decide between, and this is, we're using specialized bikes because that's what Alex rides here, but there are a lot of brands that have kind of models where it's like an almost cyclocross style gravel bike, and then a gravel bike that's much more relaxed, maybe has built-in compliance, like suspension of some kind or some sort of compliance built into it. You have the Crux, which is the more cyclocrossy side of things, and then the Diverge, which it isn't a full suspension gravel bike per se, but you have suspension up front, a unique one that's basically like the handlebars and stem themselves are suspended from the rest of the bike, which then suspends whatever's attached to that, which is your body and your upper body. And then in the back, it has compliance. It's got the compliance where the seat post actually can flex backward.
Yep.
And it has a damper that's basically allows it to move backward, and then it pulls it back into that position. So it's effectively like a full suspension gravel bike. How do you decide between the two of those?
Personally, I mean, for Tusher, it's quite easy. We climb for 80% of it. So the lighter one is the better one. So that was easy for Tusher. I think for other races, I think we're still learning where that balance is. I think mountain bike, a lot of us are so versed that you look at a course and you're like, cool, this setup, and I'll be happy. Whereas I feel like gravel's more finicky and more new, where like you look at Unbound, for example, right? Like it seemed half the people were on mountain bike tires and it seemed really fast. So I think we're still kind of learning what we use where. I've used the Crux, I think, at all the gravel races I've done. I have the STR. I just never quite felt like I needed it. I think I would go to a wider tire first with gravel to have more compliance. And that's what I've been trying this year, like with the 47 Tracers. Used to run 42s almost exclusively. So I think getting a little more compliance there and dialing in the tire pressure has been, I guess, more important than switching to the STR.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I feel like in 5 years, we're all going to be riding some sort of full suspension on gravel bikes, and that will become normal. Because I feel like, just like you said, how we, in our brains, we assume that like, a mountain bike tire can't be fast, but these larger volume tires can add a lot of compliance. And then with technology of casing and everything else, and then rim widths, they can actually roll really efficiently still too. And I feel like smooth is fast. I do believe in that saying that I hear from different brands that market that. And man, I would not be surprised to see us all on that, particularly when you see something like Flight Attendant coming out, that you might be able to build a gravel bike that's hyper efficient and then can change depending on what's going on. And that, I think, would be a huge shift that I think will happen.
Absolutely. I think that's the part I'm trying to learn right now, is like, what is smooth on gravel, right? Like, not that you don't have a lot of options, but it's like, I don't think I'd ever go to a 2.2 Renegade just because like there's not much difference. So I guess I've just come to almost always run the Renegades on the mountain bike. And now with gravel, it's like, feels like there's a lot of tinkering, whether that's like societal and not necessarily needed, but like you see everybody else tinkering, so you must also tinker. But I think I've considered for Tusher just putting the World Cup with Renegades and seeing how that feels, because I know I can ride my mountain bike really well, so kind of saves the tinkering piece of it. But I think a lot of the time advantage on gravel is actually the position that the drop bars put you in and not necessarily the tires. So like you said, it'd be interesting if it just ends up being essentially like a World Cup with drop bars.
Yeah. And I also think that people probably misunderstand the fact that a mountain bike is designed to be ran with wider bars. It doesn't mean that you have to or something.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's really hard to get a comfortable and desirable fit when you put a drop bar on a mountain bike. It really is. Like it because it's everything with where everything is placed on the bike and the fit and the way that the bike handles. It's not really designed for you to have your arms out wide and to be in that position. As a result, it's really tricky. And I've done a lot of tweaking with different athletes with trying to get drop bars set up onto a mountain bike so that it feels right. And the feel is very hard. Even if you run the trig, to be like, yes, that your hand should be in this place. And even though it's narrower width and everything else, like it should actually feel about right. And it still just feels very different. So it's a tricky gray area. I can ask on wax
mountain bikes
chains.
Are just better.
Yeah, I agree. Let's just do mountain bikes all the time. On wax chains, you ran ice friction for a long time. And for what it's worth, like everybody started running ice friction. I think that you were like one of the first athletes I ever saw using this setup. And that was a great option for all of you guys because ice friction would send you prepared chains. And in your case, you even had some cassettes and chain rings also prepared with that. Ice friction no longer is operating. It was, I think, like a business that wasn't necessary, like to sustain anything, and they enjoyed doing it. But at the same time, they're like, I've got other things that I want or need to do. And as a result, we're not going to be running the company. And the world wept that day, the professional cycling world. What are you doing for wax chains these days? Because you famously use them very, I would say like religiously, like that was your thing.
Yeah.
So what are you doing now? I think I've heard a lot of people are scrambling, trying to figure it out.
Yeah, it was funny. I actually got a text from Keegan at the beginning of the season. He's like, what are you going to do without ice? It's like, I told him, I was like, I have enough to get through this year, but we should probably figure something out. He was on the same boat. I think a bunch of us still have like a little stash to get us through at least the important races, right? We're really picky about which races we use them at now.
Yeah.
I've started working with Ceramic Speed this year. They've offered to do their UFO coating if I send them chains. Wax, I guess, sort of tangent. I actually have found that I really like their all-condition wax lube. So essentially what you do is you do 2 full coats. So essentially start at the quick link 1, 2 on both the inside and outside the night before. And essentially it gives you a wax chain in the morning. Like it dries overnight and it gets you, I'd say, pretty close. Like they feel really nice for just how easy that application is. Obviously it's not to the nth degree that ice friction was, where they bedded it in, make sure it was perfectly worn, checked it for nicks, did the whole 9 yards. I haven't quite found a solution for that. I could take them up on the UFO. The guys, we have like an internal bike shop at Specialized essentially for employees, and they just got in the Silca system. So I got one of those, like the pot with the strip chip and he gave me some molten speed wax to try. So I'll try that while I'm up in Tahoe and see if I can kind of do it myself for the races I don't have ice friction chains for this year. But yeah, haven't quite nailed down a solution. I've seen some of my, I guess, colleagues, for lack of a better word, use Cyclo Wax, but I haven't personally used it myself. I think they just partnered with the Trek teams. So that's an interesting one.
There's another one too. I feel like I'm going to try to look it up while we're on air here, but I feel like Pete Stetina has been using...
he was doing like, there's like a 4-to-1 and 11-to-1. You could change it based on like rain and stuff.
Yeah, I'm trying to see right now. Okay, so that one is called Rex Bike. I think they're based out of Europe. Rex Bicycle Products. That's another one. I think that they make like ski wax, and that's what we saw from a brand called Wend that was into this for a while too.
Oh, they did the color ones, didn't they?
Yeah, and Wend is really, really well known in the ski world. So like they're
okay.
Yeah, and they kind of translated over. I'm really curious to see how it goes with molten speed wax and everything else. And I've been running over the past 2 years now. What I've done is I've switched just to Muck Off's ceramic lube, not their ludicrous lube that they have, like their crazy stuff, but the ceramic lube, and then using that in their cleaner. And since I wash my bike every time I ride anyway, it makes it really easy.
Yep.
And it's not an issue. But the issue that I do run into is anything over like 3-ish hours that involves creek crossings and that sort of thing, the chain gets noisy. And I've found that SRAM transmission does not shift nearly as well when that thing gets dry and worn, like when it gets dirty. I feel like it actually, like you'd notice a huge difference in performance, not just in sound. So that's pushing me to rethink and try waxing again. We famously have done it here at the office, and we have like a bunch of stuff set up, and I hated doing it. I felt like I didn't get consistent results out of it too, in the sense that sometimes I'd be like, this thing is sounding terrible, and I can feel that there's friction on here. You know, when you spin the cranks with your finger, it's not really strong.
I think that's the hard part for me, is I'm so numbers oriented that I have all these options, but for me, it's hard that the way I test it is by feel, because it's like, maybe I had a little extra caffeine that day. Maybe I was just feeling good. And it's like, this is the one I like, where it's like, Ice Friction kind of took that out of it. Like when I first started working with them, I just had a long conversation with Michael, the owner, and his process was just nerdy. Like he's a mechanical engineer at heart. Like you said, it was just like a spin-off company. Like they didn't care if it was profitable. They put all the profits back into the sport. And it was just to the nth degree. Like they would wear in the chain because the new chains sucked. They had a huge like bed-in process where they'd take all the packing grease off, which was a huge piece of it. And then like they would do the hard wax and then the white powder coating. The thought process was actually that the hard wax takes the space that like any dirt or mud would get into. And then the dusting on top actually takes the place of dust. So if you pack this with wax, nothing else can get in, and it actually lubricates it as you ride it. Like you warm up the wax, and like you said, I think there, to a certain degree, when you first put on wax, there is that stiff feeling, and that's by design, right? You almost have to wear it in during your warm up, or some people put it on the day before because they're superstitious about broken chains or whatever. And so you get it to almost like you wear in the chain, you wax it, then you almost wear in the wax.
Yeah.
So it's a whole process, but I think, it's definitely a big loss to not have that confidence of them just showing up on my doorstep. But I've just for everyday training and for, those races that I don't have a wax chain for, that Ceramic Speed all condition lube, I've been super impressed with.
Yeah, I'm going to look into that, because the other thing that you don't factor in is, especially if you have like SRAM Transmission, I think the quick links are like $18 to $20 retail price, somewhere around there. So that means that and I'm saying that you should, and I know somebody's listening to this and saying like, Big Bike is trying to pull the wool over your eyes and you don't need a new quick link every time you change your chain. But they say that, and I'm sure that there are lawyers involved in having them say that. But at the same time, I've broken a chain. I don't want to run that risk. It's never worth it to me. Breaking a chain is terrifying and can be like catastrophic. So it can get really expensive, especially once you start adding in the wax and all that. And from everybody that I spoke to, I never ran an ice friction chain, but from people that are very good and detail oriented, and I would say that I'm very detail oriented on the waxing process, I still wouldn't get nearly the durability out of the chain than what you would get from ice friction. The ice friction ones, it was like people were telling me about riding with the same chain for like over a month. And they said that still, and through, we're talking all sort of conditions, and it still spun easily. So, and
that was the thing with ice friction, is the value proposition was, I always told people it's cheaper than lube. Like you run it for that month, like you have training chains and racing chains, right? And then what the cool thing about ice is you could send it back for re-icing, and essentially they'll tell you if the chain's past, being good, you can purchase a new one. But if it was still good, they'll strip it, re-ice it for you. And that, essentially just meant saving time, right? You didn't have to wax your chain before lube your chain or wax your chain before every ride. And it was probably cheaper than the lube you were going to buy most of the time. So you could kind of just buy 2 chains and just swap them out, right? Send this one in and run this one, then run this one and swap that one in. So yeah, definitely going to be missed. But it was the right decision for Michael at the time, and I respect that.
Let's talk about all the stuff you're wearing on your body. Any changes this year? I think that probably not, in the sense that like the helmet's the same. You usually run the Aero helmet, right? That Specialized has.
Yeah. Evade 90% of the time, Prevail if it's hot. I think the new Evade, I think we're on the 3 now, cools really well and that doesn't bother me. So, and there's not a huge weight difference either way.
Yeah.
So most of the time on the Evade, but Prevail mainly for like mountain biking and stuff if I'm just riding around at slow speeds anyway. Apparel is still DNA. Same recon shoes for the last few years now. So no major changes on body. Oakley glasses, Specialized
Sweet.
gloves.
Easy stuff. And on the gloves, by the way, do you run the Pro SLs for the gloves?
Yes.
Yeah. And that's like a minimalist glove instead of one that's going to have like a strap or be a bit more padded out or anything else. It's like a minimalist glove. But the cool part is, glove manufacturers, I hope you're listening to this. Like, you don't need to perforate the palms. It's okay. We don't need it. And
I got sweaty palms.
Yeah. Well, and the thing is, like when you have like the Pro SL has a palm that isn't perforated and it still breathes just fine. And it still manages because the fact that the rest of the glove is vented means that it manages that moisture that develops in your hands just fine. And it makes it so that your hand is way more protected, and it makes it so the glove lasts way longer too. So glove manufacturers are probably now poking holes all over because they want them to be replaced faster and for us to buy them, more of them. But I think that's a key. What about nutrition side of things? USWE packs still, you famously use those. And then, we'll get into the other stuff in a bit, but what pack are you using?
Still the USWE. And then Carbs Fuel, just announced my partnership officially with them, but been working with them since the beginning of the year. So I'll use their gels mostly. I kind of just separate fueling and hydration, at least for racing at this point. So I get the carbs from the gels and then essentially just put salt in water to get the sodium I need. So essentially matching what I got in the sweat test, right? So I sweat about 2 grams of sodium per liter. So essentially 1 milligram of sodium per 1 milligram of fluid is essentially what I do. So in a 750 bottle, I try to have 750 milligrams sodium. So essentially I'm replacing as I'm drinking there. And then for Carbs Fuel, I've gone up at the end of Unbound to as much as 1 every 20 minutes, which is 150 grams with no GI distress. Wow. Nice. We'll normally start races at 100 just because we have a lot on board already. And then kind of transition roughly every 3 hours. So I do the first 3 hours at 100 grams per hour, then the next 3 hours at 120. And then I tend to, once the race gets long enough, my body's just like, give me anything you can. So essentially as many as I can get in there and my stomach doesn't throw a fit. So,
but I'm sure that a lot of that's down to the composition, like in the fact that you've trained your stomach with it. But if it has a bad composition, taking in more of it will mess up your gut. And when I say bad composition, it could just be bad ingredients or a bad profile with the different types of sugar that are within it.
Oh, for sure. And Aaron over at Carbs Fuel, I call him Chief Nerd Officer, but he designed the Carbs Fuel gel mix, and it has no gelling agents, no preservatives, so pretty much no extra stuff. They pasteurize it when they fill it, which still gives it a 24-month best by date, which is super impressive. But we were talking and nerding out about it, and I didn't realize there was so many different types of maltodextrin, which adjust like flavor, texture, and all this different stuff. And so he was testing it out to get like the right consistency he wanted for the gel. And so that was super cool. And I mean, 50 grams of carbs per gel just makes like a race like Tusher, right? Where we have to carry all the stuff ourselves. It's self-supported. I need to get through 4 hours of racing. Before that would be like 12 to 15 gels in my pocket, which when you're climbing is a lot.
Your pockets are full.
Yeah. So now it's just 8 gels, and I just take one every 30 minutes and we're dialed. So I think super helpful there, and just a super. And I talk about this a lot, but with the full-time job, I don't endorse anybody that I wouldn't pay my own money for. And I did pay my own money for. That's essentially how all my partnerships start, is I'm like, oh, that's cool. I'll buy one and then reach out to the company, or someone will introduce me. And with these, it was just a big part of what I want to do is getting more people riding bikes. Like, that's why I love this podcast. Like, it introduces me to a lot of people with a lot of questions, and I can answer those questions and make it so their ride is better, make it so they actually ride. Like, I get notes on Instagram. They're like, I rode today because of you. And it's like, that's insane. Like, I never ever thought that would be where I would stand within the cycling world. So Carbs Fuel is very similar. It was like they came out of seeing World Tour riders essentially eating Haribo because they couldn't afford to properly fuel their sport. And so they're like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And that's where the gel came from. And that's how ultimately they're $2 each, right? Like, I was doing a cost analysis Unbound. I went through, I think it was 26 gels. So 1,300 grams of carbs, $52. But you take that same $1,300 and break it down like standard cost of a gel, like,
yeah, 1,300 grams.
It could be
it's crazy.
$120 to $150 for that Unbound race versus the $50 I spent. So
yeah,
just
good deal.
A cool company doing cool things, and they're committed to, making it so more people can effectively fuel their sport. And I think that aligns really well beyond the product part, but just on an ethos level of getting more people riding bikes or more people outside.
Yeah. I have one more question on the recovery side of things. What recovery tools are you using these days, or do you find useful? Or maybe if it's not a tool, just like a modality that you go through or a process?
He might get mad if I call him a tool, but I started working with Chris Lowe this year. He's a dietitian out of the UK. And one of the things I noticed is if I end my ride at home, most of the time we go to a proper meal instead of a shake. So I used to just do, and I still do sometimes, like if I do the group ride, I'll just do Gatorade powder mixed with Bob's Whey protein, just a very simple carb to protein ratio. But most of the time I'll get back and I'll make like chicken and rice and veggies or something like that and actually get the recovery from real food. So that's been one big change that we've made on like the dietitian side is I used to take a recovery mix after every ride, right? Like I think we were all part of that era where it's like you finish the ride, you have the recovery shake. And so I think that was a big change for me is we just get it from real food now and done a lot more fruits and veggies. So like I'll do that. And a lot of the times I'll do like honey bunches of oats with maybe some mixed nuts, yogurt, honey, blueberries, like between lunch and dinner. And so just getting, like we talked about on this podcast before, right? Like trying not to supplement with the antioxidant stuff and getting it just straight from the source. And so I've enjoyed it. Gets me a lot more fruit, which I enjoy.
Yeah. What about, are you a compression boot user or any other little tool that you use for recovery?
I use the compression boots daily, mainly because I can multitask. So I can sit at my desk in the boots essentially. So I like anything that essentially makes it so I don't have to do the work. I'll roll when I have time. I actually use Derek's, I think it's like his post-ride one he showed me years ago, way back. And then, so I'll use that one, which is like a full body roll. And then I'll see a massage therapist probably once every 2 weeks.
Nice. Awesome. Well, Alex, thanks a bunch for, and if this is a dense one, and hopefully you got lots of images on YouTube here showing the different things that we're talking about. It'll be a lot of work for Rob, our editor. Thanks, Rob, for doing all that. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this one, going deep with Alex. We know that Alex pays attention to the details. We know that a lot of you do the same. If you have questions that have risen from this, and I'm sure that you do, put them down in the YouTube comments and let us know. And then that way, what we can do is we can go back through and we can look at these and maybe find some material that you guys want to discuss on future podcasts. You can submit your questions at trainerroad.com/podcast. And if you appreciate this podcast, you can go sign up with TrainerRoad. We're making huge advancements with AI. We've had like some really exciting, basically like the frequency of these is increasing substantially, but very exciting meetings recently looking at some cool stuff. Sign up, get on board, get faster. We'll talk to you all next time. Thanks, everybody.